Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Jamie Q. Roberts. Jamie is an author and he's got a book out, or has got a book about to come out, I believe. It's called The Intellectual Dark Web, A History and a Possible Future. Hey Jamie, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I just want to clarify this. Your book is about to be released, correct?
Well, it was released about a year ago through an academic publisher,
Mhm.
but it only survived about 2 weeks before they pulled it from sales. So yeah, the book about the premier free speech movement of our time got cancelled. So I guess I'm happy about that. I told my best friend about it, and the first thing he said to me was "Congratulations."
Yeah.
So,
Okay,
but
no,
yeah,
I
but it's
yeah,
anyway, I got a
yeah,
new publisher, luckily, and yeah, and it's coming out again.
yeah.
So that's tremendous.
Okay, no, good. I misunderstood. I thought it was about to be published, and at the last minute they pulled it, and then you got to go find someone else or something like that.
It's similar, but it actually made it out, and it actually sold copies. So it's now a rare book. So it sold copies that even managed to get a few Google reviews or something like that. So so yeah, a few people got to it before they pulled the plug.
So I guess my first question would be, what made you think of or decide to write a book on the IDW? I mean, it's a relatively new phenomenon. It's sort of still ongoing in some form or other, but I'm just curious, like what was the impetus of writing that history of something that was still kind of, you know, in the thick of it?
Yeah, good question. So so I guess I first was onto these problems in to a degree 1999, but properly 2002. And as I say in the beginning of the introduction to this book, when I use I don't know, an analogy with the third Alien movie, when Ripley says, "You've been in my life so long, I can't remember anything else." Honestly, since 2002, it's just been struggling against cancel culture, postmodernism, identity politics, and everything it's become. And it's been a pretty relentless and miserable and consistent battle. Um, in the early days, I sort of barely knew what I was up against because I'm at a university in Australia, and everyone seems to be drinking the Kool-Aid. No one's talking about it. I'm sort of, it's like you want to shake everyone and say, guys, you're doing it wrong. Like this whole university academic thing, you're all doing it wrong. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out how it had gone so wrong, and why it was so hard to talk about these things, and why whenever I did, I got, punished in one way or another. And so it was this, just this long, painful experience, which has left me basically being a sort of a fringe academic until recent years, which is another story. I accidentally fell into a proper academic position. Yeah, it's another story. But anyway, so I've been battling against this for ages, somewhat badly, and trying to build up all my own ideas and trying to, I wrote my PhD thesis about, it's about a lot of things, but it was a political philosophy work, um, where essentially I was trying to understand why the people around me seemed so damn religious. And I tried to understand, when you had like good religion, bad religion, and anyway, this is a very long discussion, but basically I developed a kind of model of politics, or even what could you call it, human ontology, where I kind of conceived of everyone as being religious. And then the question then was, well, what kind of religious person do you want to be? And my sense was all the academics around me were doing it very, very poorly. And it was some kind of weird cult. Anyway, I'm really rambling here. But around 2016 or 17, I came across, I started to come across the IDW figures: Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Eric Weinstein, Brett Weinstein. And it was remarkable because every single thing they were saying was everything that I'd been struggling with and trying to push against. And I was like, oh wow, this is tremendous. We're all seeing the same thing. We're all battling against exactly the same thing. and it, made me feel pretty comforted, frankly, because I thought, oh wow, I'm not totally insane. There is a very clear, systematic problem going on here. Um, and so I started listening to a lot of podcasts. And then around, must have been 2019, 2020, sometime around then, I spoke, I was speaking to people more and more and found that other people were all listening to the same stuff and that we all had, and that we're all like, yeah, well, what can I say? I could say around 2019 or 2020, it became really clear to me that there was a very definable set of ideas that IDW and IDW types promulgated. And once I really locked in that there were, I mean, I don't know how you want to quantify it, 10, 15, 20, but there was just a number of very, very clear points that everyone shared. There was a common enemy. And I just thought, wow, this is so clear that that I can write a book about it. I was also, as I said, not exactly accidentally, but having spent 10 years not being an academic exactly, but working with a university, I remarkably fell into an academic position. And of course, one of the requirements is you publish. So I thought, well, what better thing could I do than write a book about this whole movement, which is seems to be at the very core of our time, intellectually, politically. And so yeah, I managed to swing a book contract with an academic publisher, which I'm actually amazed about. I'm amazed they let the book get as far as it did. But, that's a long story as well. I had a good editor who was on my side. And so I think it flew under the radar until the book came out. And then the trouble started. But what can I say? In a nutshell, I wrote the book because, it's the exact issues I've been struggling with for over 20 years. And so it was the only thing to write about, essentially, for me.
Okay. Just one thing on it before I get back to your book, but you mentioned that you've been like pushing back against this since the late 90s, early 2000s, or maybe
Yeah.
said 2002.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was in university in Canada in the early 90s. So, I got out of school in 95, and I did political science. So I came across postmodernism and postcolonialism. That was,
Yeah.
postmodernism was kind of baked in everything, and postcolonialism, well, that fit right in with the poli sci. Um, but I didn't, intersectionality wasn't really, it was on the campus, but it wasn't really like ubiquitous in all the other departments, right? Like there wasn't a lot of
No,
humanities departments
no.
using that lens. Um, but it was starting around that time, like I think Crenshaw and Crenshaw and them were like starting up in about 89, 88, 89. They started writing. And then,
Hmm.
by the early 90s, it was slowly starting to come into universities and becoming its own thing. Um, and not Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, who you mentioned in your book, he also said that at one point we need to get back to a 1997 mindset, which is kind of where he demarks where this
Yeah.
stuff really started taking off. Because everyone focuses on like 2013, 2014, when it started leaking off the campuses and coming out into real world, if you want to use that expression. So when you say you were doing it from 2002, like I noticed some of it when I was in school. It was just the tail end of the political correctness stuff, but I would see it more on campus than I would when I was, I worked, I had a job at an insurance company while I was going to school. When I went to work, people were just kind of amazed when I would bring up some stuff I heard in school, and they're like, "Where are you coming up with this garbage?" I'm like,
Hmm.
"University." And so, I'm just curious about like, because a lot of people just think, okay, it just kind of came on the scene in 2013, but it had been brewing in the background for a long time. So, I'm just kind of curious about that. Like, how ubiquitous was it back then compared to now? Like now, it just seems like it's everywhere. Whenever I speak to any kind of professor or any kind of academic, they're just, you know, they they're basically just, it's everywhere. They can't get away from it.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm just curious about it back then.
Okay. I mean, as I even talk about in the book, you can go further back. I mean, Peterson, for example, is often, or people often call them, Marxists, and it's not entirely clear why you'd call these postmodernists and intersectionalists Marxists, especially when they're often the rich people these days. So, I mean, I don't know if I'll say much about that, but there's an element in which Marxism is about collective identity, and there's another key element in which it's the human mind is something of a blank slate, and the human is malleable. And so you just need an expert class to mold them and bring about the utopia. So you've got strands of that. You've got strands of Nietzschean slave morality, where only the weakest. This is very important. I mean, this is pretty Marxist, and Nietzsche was onto it, way back in the day. But yeah, only the weakest have access to the true and the good, is the short of it. And I mean, it's very important to distinguish between sticking up for people who are disadvantaged and saying that the disadvantaged have some kind of magical power, which is kind of where we've ended up. So look, you can go even further back to those kinds of thoughts. You can go back to the 60s and 70s with Foucault, who said, I mean, he said a lot of things, but basically what people get out of Foucault is we don't have access to reality. Truth is a social construct of power. So, so those ideas started embedding it, and that's all tied up with neo-Marxist thought. That's tied up with slave morality. And so, of course, that's the thing that started growing in academia once the academics got sick of Marxism, because it was so obvious that the Soviet Union wasn't working out. So, you needed a new kind of left-wing thing, which was post-structuralism, which we now call postmodernism. So, yeah, that started growing. It was fringe. I started out studying psychology, but I ended up doing my undergraduate degree in English literature. I'm still, even though I teach politics, I'm ultimately a literature person. That's another long discussion. But in the literature department, I'm just thinking about all the figures we had then. There was quite a few just old school literature people, which basically are my kinds of people. Let's read the good books and work out what various complex things they are saying about the human condition. And then there was a scattering of what we would call the postmodernists or the post-structuralists, like whatever, the intersectionalists, the feminists, and they were growing. They were growing in number, and they were growing in power. And so when I was there in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was when the conflict was there. The conflict was on. And I ended up getting supervised in my honors dissertation, which is a thing you do in Australia and England. It's like a 20,000 word short thesis. I ended up getting supervised by one of these figures. And so I really came up against it. During my honors thesis. And so I was asked to do things that I really did not believe in and did not think were right. So, yeah, my sense is that, okay, 97, John McWhorter. I mean, I've heard that's one of the memes at the moment. We got to go back to the left wing or the liberal society of the 1990s, perhaps. 1980s, 1990s, perhaps. I mean, back then, my idea of a leftist, an intellectual leftist, is a kind of somewhat hippie-looking school teacher who loves teaching the classics and has a passion for the student with the spark in his or her eye. And I'm thinking, yeah, I dig that. That's my idea of leftism. And then, yeah, somewhere in the 80s or 90s, that kind of character who appears in movies and whatnot became subsumed by by whatever you want to now call it, the woke academic, the intersectionalist, the post-structuralist. And yeah, they just grew, they became stronger and stronger, more and more of them, especially because it's the easy path. You don't really have to do anything. You don't really have to do real research. You don't really have to struggle. You say the words and, magic. You get good marks in the essays, you get the degrees, you get the PhDs, you get the scholarships, you get the academic appointments, you publish the articles. And so as much as we can talk about it as this left-wing ideology, I mean, I'm not sure it's left-wing ideology at all. I'm sure what my sense is it's ultimately just about lazy people working out how to game the system, which is why the whole woke thing doesn't look particularly left, and why workers get mentioned a bit, but workers in their droves are flowing to the likes of Trump. So,
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, that covered a bit of territory.
Yeah, no, it's good. Look, just like I said, I'd like to talk about your book, but it just when you mentioned 2002, it just kind of just sparked my interest a bit.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say, like I liked, okay, I liked your book like a lot. I liked your book a lot, but one of the things I particularly liked about it was, and it was something I discussed a few years back with this guy named Ryan Bennett, and Ryan had done and was doing work at that time with Brett Weinstein. So like he was helping Brett Weinstein build up like a Discord server and like get a community going and stuff like that. But he talked about the IDW as a protocol, and you mentioned that in the first part of your book where it's not just a group of people, like it's a bunch of different things, and one of them was a protocol on how to initiate conversation and how to have like how to have discourse on some of these topics, be it race or transgenderism or police brutality, climate change or whatever, but just a way to have a proper conversation. And I really like the fact that you mentioned that in your book, that it wasn't, because when you mention IDW, everyone just thinks of half a dozen or 2 dozen people, and they say, okay, that's the IDW.
Yeah.
It's just my personal feeling. I think it would have been much better off. I'm not saying you don't need the people, but if they'd focused on that protocol approach instead of on the people themselves, which I think was a failing of the IDW.
Yeah. Interesting point. I mean, it is. I mean, I quote Brett Weinstein. He's got like the seminal quote in the book. He essentially just says the whole point of the IDW is that the pursuit of truth comes before your own personal agenda, or let's say your own personal agenda is the pursuit of truth. Yeah, and everything flows outwards from that. So, yeah, I mean, frankly, that's just about the core of civilization in so many different ways as well. I mean, somehow the pursuit of, okay, maybe truth or maybe some other goods, but at some point these things have to go before naked power, or not so naked power. And yeah, so yeah, that's the heart of it. It's a basic protocol, civil discussion, so you don't descend into name calling, even if you are a bit triggered. Some kind of sense that you could be wrong, some degree of humility. I mean, this stuff's so hard for me because I mean, I'm quite passionate and strong-minded about quite a lot of issues, but at the same time, I have this sort of tortured sense of, yeah, am I right? Am I wrong? I don't know. All I can, and when I teach, when I talk to my students, I mean, often I have to be reasonably passionate and driven about certain points, but then I also say to them, look, all we still have in the end is open discussion. So every single thing I say, please challenge it. It's open to challenge. Even if I feel uncomfortable about it, I have to open myself up to challenge. And so it always disappoints me when sometimes the students do argue, but then, yeah, sometimes they just, name call in the background and dob on you to, to people higher up and things like that. But yeah, I digress. But it's a protocol, and this is the protocol.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's when you were having a hard time, is it woke? Is it progressive? Helen Pluckrose says critical social justice. You know, that's what that's what makes it so hard to confront. It's kind of like
Mm.
the Supreme Court case from the '60s. When he was just the justice was asked to describe pornography, he's like, "Well, I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it." And it's the same thing with like woke or whatever you want to call it. But I think that was part of the problem with the IDW. It was,
Mm.
I realized, Eric Weinstein was trying to form, coalesce this loose group of people. But when he gave it that name, he put out something to be attacked at that point. Whereas before
Ah.
you could attack Ben Shapiro, or you could attack one of the Weinsteins, or you could attack Sam Harris, or you could attack any one of these one individual people. But when you gave that name together, then it was like, okay, we're going to attack this, and then just attacking everyone at once. Like, look, at one point or another, a movement, or I don't want to call it a movement, but for lack of a better term, a movement like the IDW has to have a name, and it has to have put a starting point. But like I said, I think that was one of the weaknesses, giving it a name too early. Whereas if they'd worked on, hey, we're just trying to work out a way to have conversations, and left it at that until you gave it a name, I think it would have been better served. But like I said, that's hindsight 2020 and all that.
And yet the conversations continue. So even people got sick of the name. It sort of splintered a bit. There was internal tensions, um, which carry on.
Yeah.
I'm actually in the middle of one of them now, funnily enough, with the book. But I won't say anything about that. Uh, but um, but yeah, the conversations carry on though. So in a way, whatever the broader phenomenon they started, I mean, someone like Peter Boghossian's, he's trying to do his street epistemology,
Yeah.
which is it's an IDW type thing. You get people out there, you get them to choose a position, talk about their ideas. Um, yeah, I hear what you're saying though.
Yeah, I know. Look, you know, I appreciate what they did, and I appreciate that they brought a lot of these things to light and made it easier for people to have conversations about it. One thing I will say though, and I found, because I know you mentioned new atheism in your book as well, and that was one of my biggest critiques of new atheism. And I'll
Yes.
say the same thing about the IDW in that sense. So the new atheists, I mean, just let's just take Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, and then Daniel Dennett as well. Like if those are 4 or 5 horsemen, like the core group there.
Yeah.
Okay, Dawkins, I'm not saying brilliant man, follows the scientific method, reason, logic. Harris brought it up a lot. Um, Dennett came out from a philosophy point of view, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali was also more from the rationality point of view. But that was one of the issues with the new atheist movement was they said, okay, go out. They almost went out and made the argument from authority. It's like, okay, college educated people, the scientific method, discourse, and they were
Mm.
defending academia, but I don't think they realized how corrupted academia had become. So that's why
Maybe not.
that's why like I in North America what I call a lot of the atheists were part of that whole thing. They sprung up during that whole new atheism thing. So people in the states like Matt Dillahunty or Seth Andrews, so a lot of the atheist organizations in the U.S. and Canada. I don't know so much about the UK or Australia, so I don't want to comment on that. But they took on woke ideology, and so for the past few years, I've been calling them woke evangelicals because that new atheism movement gave so much stock in education, and I'm not saying that they were the only people, but they gave so much stock in education and reason, and they put so much value in it that these people who came up and became atheists, a lot of them, like Matt Dillahunty, was a preacher, and then he went from being a Christian evangelical to a woke evangelical. I mean, it's and I'm not saying Dillahunty's stupid or he doesn't understand, but there's a lot of these people who they're like the followers or the people in the movements, just the peons or whatever. I know it from an ex-Muslim standpoint. These people first time they got introduced to new thought was in universities, and so if you come from an Islamic standpoint or from a very strict Christian standpoint, you're coming across anti-racism or intersectionality or gender studies, and these things say, okay, we're going to fight homophobia, we're going to fight racism, we're going to fight misogyny, and this was what they were trying to break out from their religion. And they were told by these, like people like Dawkins and Harris. Hitchens, not so much. Hitchens was actually good to his word, and he pushed a lot of that stuff. But Ayaan Hirsi Ali, they heard from all of them. Okay, well, oh well, the academy, the scientific method, having discourse and how, like all those ideas. So for these people who had never seen anything else before, they were just from a
Mm.
strict religious background, and they were trying to rebel against it. They came across this stuff that, in theory, looked like it was opposing all these things, and so they glommed onto it. And I think that's kind of where the IDW sort of went off the rails a little bit too. It's they were having the same conversation over and over again, and after a certain point, I think they should have pivoted more towards solutions than just labeling the problems over and over again. And I think that's where it because a lot of the people now, like a lot of the people who are having these conversations, just ever since I got into this space myself, I've been pretty tuned into what's going on, and it's a cursory reading of everything. Like they didn't even read the Cole's notes. They read the shorter version of the Cole's notes, and they have a very, very surface level of understanding of what any of this is. Yet they're trying to take on those conversations. I think that's where the IDW failed, kind of like where New Atheism failed. They didn't hammer home enough about things like the protocol, like how this is how to have a conversation, this is how to get towards good discussion. It became more of a, and I don't think it was any of them intentionally. It might have been just the media or the people who were, like podcast hosts who were having them on. It became almost a cult of personality.
Yeah.
Like the protocol lasted and people are having these conversations, but I think some of the conversations that are being had are at such a surface level that when people talk about CRT, like critical race theory, oh well, it's just anti-whiteness. It's like no, it's not really anti-white. They're saying the white, it's a power struggle, and they're saying the white people have the power, so that's why it's anti-white. But it's don't focus on the fact that it's just anti-white racism. But that's the surface level understanding they have of this stuff, and I think that was a detriment to the IDW. Like, uh, sorry, I rambled on for a bit there.
No, it's fine. It's very interesting to hear all of this. I mean, when you're talking, um, I mean, I mentioned my doctoral thesis before when I tried to write a theory of everything, not a physics one. But yeah, I didn't explain it well the first time around at all. But one of the fundamental questions which inspired me is why is it that things that seem to start out on the right track inevitably get corrupted? And you hear people talking about this all the time. I forget what the line is. Things start out as I don't know, a rebellion, and then they become a movement, then they become a this, then they become a that, then they become a racket. And so when I was trying to make sense of this when I was in my 20s, yeah, I mean, I came across, for example, Enemy of the People by Ibsen, which is a good play. And the main character, Dr. Stockman's dealing with something vaguely similar, trying to push back against the mob, and everyone has interests. But he has a great line where he says, and this is the 19th century, he says, every good idea lasts for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, 20 at the most. And then after that, it gets taken up by the masses and twisted and dumbed down, and you got to start again. And he was saying a decade or two back in the 19th century. Now I think sometimes we're lucky if we get a year or two out of a good idea or a good process before somehow money gets involved and status gets attached to it. And so we're sort of in that phase now of the IDW of just endless podcasts and, tiers of association, and who knows what's going on anymore. And then, it's basically become part of the whole sort of Trump presidency now. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing yet. So I kind of, I feel dismayed often when I was hearing you talk, because I was just thinking, yeah, so much. It has this wonderful moment of genuine rebellion, a wonderful moment of true insight and excitement. And then in ways that are so hard to see at the moment, it goes off the rails. So yeah, I mean, if it held to the protocol, and then I'm thinking like, okay, great. Well, then if it holds to the protocol, but then the protocol becomes dogma, and then people get denounced for not holding to the protocol. And it's just like, this is just like a deeply human problem. And so it's like, I think I say this in the book as well. I think there's some line, what is it? The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao, sort of in Taoism.
Yeah.
And so it's a great line, because it's like, well, once you manage to lock it in and put words around it, you've already lost it. So there's some kind of deeper spirit, which, I don't know, we each have to hold within ourselves, which is something like trying to hold to the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it's, yeah, these movements spring up, which are good for a little while, and then they get corrupted, and then another movement's needed. And so maybe this is the process or the trajectory of humanity in the biggest picture. And the fact that we actually can keep society on something of a middle path is already a great victory, given that probably the last 100,000 years of humanity has been relentless conflict. And famine and God knows what else. Um, so yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being pretty lofty in general here, but this is what comes to mind when I hear you say all of this stuff. Like I don't know. I quote Shakespeare's Sonnet 66 in the epigraph to the book, and it's the most. I talk about it as much as I can. It's the most powerful, hard hitting, stunning, brilliant piece of 14 lines I've ever come across, and it just articulates what we're dealing with now. And it's like this pissed Shakespeare off 400 years ago. And so, it's it's the same problems, like identical problems. And yeah, I don't know. That's kind of my response. That's what I was thinking when you were talking.
Yeah, no, that's good. I look, I mean, I respect them for what they did, and I respect them for how they came across. But at some points, and it's with all of them, but and maybe it's just because of the atheism thing. Like out of all of them, I think I was most disappointed, and it seems kind of arrogant for me to say this, but I used to respect Sam Harris a lot. So I left Islam a long time ago. Like I'm in my 50s. I left it when I was 16, so close to 40 years ago. But when they were all coming out and Sam Harris was talking about Islam and like him and all the others, but I respected his voice. And then when the IDW first started unraveling, like after the first Trump election, and when I say unraveling, I mean that group of people started unraveling.
Yeah.
There was a brief moment of time when, and I use Sam as a example of this, but he wasn't the only one who were talking about how the excesses of the left led to Trump. But almost from the moment of his inauguration, instead of trying to fix their own side, they just focused on Trump. And I think that's where that first big splinter in the IDW happened. And then you had COVID, and then that led to more. Um,
Yep.
you know, so it was. I think in some ways it was kind of bound to happen because you have bunch of people who are very, you know, who are very smart, very articulate, and all, to some degree or other, or different variations of have a very strong personalities. And then when you get to these contentious issues, they're not going to back down more or less. And it's like in that sense they are kind of betraying that ideal of that protocol, but it happened. And so, and again, I think that's from my end, that's where I thought Sam was the most wrong in that splinter. But it's just because
Hmm.
look, I'm not. If you ask me my opinions of Trump, I tell you straight out, I think the guy's a moron. I think he's unpredictable. I don't think he. I've been saying it since the 2016 elections in the States, the last three elections. Even though I'm in Canada, I said if I was living in the U.S., I would vote down ticket because I didn't think anyone was worth voting for in the last three elections in the U.S. Not one of them was worth voting for, as far as I was concerned. If your concern was the excesses of your side led to worse than Hitler,
Hmm.
why don't you fix your side? That was my biggest grievance with Sam Harris and a lot of other people who are associated with like IDW adjacent, if you want to say that. But like there was there was not enough. Like they got so overwhelmed by Trump that they couldn't see anything else. And like I said, I think that was like that first big splinter that led to a lot of that fracturing of the group.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I mean, there was the famous Sam Harris on trigonometry episode
Yeah.
where where it was, yeah, where it was all too clear, unfortunately. Yeah, the COVID fracture. It's interesting though when you talk about fixing your own side. Um, so for better or worse, I've been on the left throughout my adult life. Quite far to the left when I was younger. Now I don't know anymore. Now I'm probably just somewhere around the middle for, I don't know, reasons we could or may not talk about. Um, but yeah, when you start focusing on the anti-woke stuff and start trying to criticize your own side, I mean, having done this at university, everyone just assumes you're conservative and some kind of alt-right fascist. So just to touch on that point, there is, as far as I mean, I've tried, or as far as I can see, there's not much fixing your own side. Like it's thankless, close to impossible. Although you can reach any number of inquiring minds in the middle, but yeah, but there, I don't know. The focus on Trump by Harris, yeah, it seemed excessive to me. So I hear what you're saying about that.
Look, I'm not saying don't pay attention to the man or whatever, but it just he got so much press everywhere that some of these people who were supposed to be quote unquote alternative media should
Mm.
have done some stuff that was alternative to what was going on in like the mainstream press. That's just, it.
I hear, I hear.
Yeah, I don't want to go on. We could go on about this forever, but yeah, I don't want to
Hmm.
just focus on that. Now, the first part of your book, you're kind of going through the history of the IDW. You go through postmodernism. You go through some of that. Now, the second half, you are talking more about. You spent talking about like free speech. I mean, you talk about free speech about the whole book, but you're
Hmm.
focusing on their platforms on free speech or their platforms on race or intersectionality. Again, when you listen to each of these people speak now, like I think Harris would agree with, let's say, Gad's Head, because I think that was one of the biggest fallouts that they had. I think he would agree with him on Gad's stance on critical race theory. He
Hmm.
might not agree with him on Trump or Gad's Head stance on like intersectionality or something.
Probably everything except Trump, I almost
Yeah,
think.
yeah. So that in itself to me is like a big disappointment in these people. So much in common
Hmm.
that they talked about this protocol, yet they couldn't get themselves to do it. And like I said, it's what you were just talking about before with ideas only lasting 10, 20 years. And then you said it's much shorter now. But so if you look at it, the birth of the IDW was 2016ish, 20 somewhere around there, 2016, 2018, somewhere in that thing. If you want to look at the when it started up, like
Yep.
this current group by 2020 they were like
Yeah, they were done.
yeah, and they couldn't even find common ground, even though their whole raison d'être was having common ground and having these conversations and trying to reach out to the other side, right, or trying to fix your
Yes.
side. So yeah,
Alas.
yeah, that was that was kind of disappointing and disheartening. And do you think that had an effect on? Yes, we're still having the conversations, but did it make the conversations diluted? And did we get like third rate pundits like say Candace Owens or
Okay.
something?
Yes. No,
Mhm.
I hear what you're saying. And like one of the concerns which I talk about is, and Helen Pluckrose, um, what was she on Rebel Wisdom? Doesn't have very many views, unfortunately, because it's one of the best talks I've come across, best sort of 5 minutes. She talks about fighting postmodernism from the left. And I yeah, I really like that idea, because what has happened is all of these IDW ideas have become not, I mean, I don't want to degrade them too much, but to a degree, as you say, they've become sound bites or they've become memeified, and they've become heavily taken up with the right to the extent that they underpin a lot of Trump's platform. And it is disappointing because for a while there, there was some hope that maybe this could be some kind of middle path, some kind of new way where you maintain a high degree of intellectual depth. You resist just jumping from one side to the other. And I'm conscious of that in myself, you know. I mean, I taken so many hits from the left. It's very tempting to join the right because you're so sick of the abuse, basically. And so, yeah, it's a pity that the IDW wasn't able to hold us some sort of open-minded middle ground. And but yeah, it has become a bit McDonald'sified and just become, yeah, part of the right-wing platform. But I'm also not so down on that because, I mean, as so many people talk about, the left and the right ain't what they used to be. I mean, the left used to be the home of free speech and open discussion and eccentricity to a fair extent. And if that's now taken up by the right, and if it's not clear that the left is on the side of the workers anymore, certainly in America, then if left and right have actually shifted, then that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I don't know, I'm playing both sides of the argument here. Yeah, to some extent, it is, things have got a bit simplified or dumbed down. On the other hand, I do maintain a degree of hope that the right will champion free speech sufficiently that we see some sort of reinvigoration of commitment to truth across our institutions. Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful, but I'm also cautious and a little leery. I think Douglas Murray was he's like, I'm not neither an optimist or a pessimist. It's just I take things as they come and see what happens. But yeah, one thing,
Maybe, yeah.
yeah, one thing I do like, because you mentioned this, and this is something I've been kind of harping about as well. The left-right thing, or centrist, like left and right, liberal, conservative, have lost all meaning. And if it's what's left in the United States is center right in Canada, you know, like it's same thing in the UK. I don't know as much about Australia, but like there's a the meaning of the word left is different in the US, it's different in Canada, I think Canada's closer to the UK, and it's different in continental Europe. And same thing with right, and same thing with conservative. And so conservative or liberal, in the States, liberal could mean anything from, John Milton to uh, Karl Marx, right? It which Marx wasn't a liberal, but everything gets conflated. So I was saying when I got back from overseas, and I was just seeing all this, and it just didn't make any sense. I was joking around with it at first, and then I was getting a little bit more serious, but still kind of tongue in cheek. And I just said, let's just start having a values based system. And when I say a values based
Sure.
system, like the name of it. So I just said, okay, you know what? I support Enlightenment values. So I'm going to call myself an Enlightenmentarian. That's it. You know, I don't care where, like, I'll tell you what my values are and I'll tell you what I use as my foundational beliefs and how I will come at issues. And you can put me wherever you want on your political spectrum. I don't care. Like, you'll at least know where I'm coming from. You know,
Sure.
because the rest of it it's just noise. It doesn't have any meaning anymore.
Yeah, I ponder this all the time. I've got a conservative cousin in the US, and I'm like, all right, cuz, let's do this. What does conservatism mean to you? Where do I sit on the political spectrum? Um, and for him, he talks about choice, abortion. He talks about gay marriage. He talks about small government, uh, possibly Christianity. And I think, okay, that's pretty interesting. So, on pretty much all those measures, I'm definitely to the left of you and somewhere around the center. But yeah, at the same time, I feel like the left's traditional strength is trying to lift up the disadvantaged, provide opportunity. And the right's traditional strength is getting behind enterprise and energy and the people who can do things. And so together they make a sort of a dialectic of the left worrying about, lifting up the people who have been left behind, and the right sort of driving onwards with enterprise. So I feel like, to me, that's still a meaningful distinction. But the left is now focusing heavily on identity politics and equality of outcome, which is a corruption. The right still focuses on energy and enterprise, but also free speech. So I still feel like there's a meaningful distinction between left and right, but whatever we've ended up with now is odd, to the extent that the right looks a little left in some ways, and the left, insofar as all this sort of woke stuff's tied up with elitism in the corporate world, the left looks kind of right. But yeah, I
Yeah.
hear what you're saying. Totally. Like, just it's a lot easier to go, yeah, I'm an Enlightenment thinker. I believe in reasoning, evidence, open discussion, treating everyone with common decency, some sort of idea of common humanity. Um, hoping that that then underpins progress as it has in many ways, and trying to deal with each particular problem or issue as it arises. I feel like that's the sensible path. Um, because ultimately, I think ultimately as a society, it's very hard for each of us to embody, let's say, the right path if there is one, which is why we have democracy, is that maybe a bunch of people vote one way, a bunch of people vote the other, and across time, the needle swings back and forth, and we have a dialectical process which keeps us on something of a good path. Because I think it's hard for individuals themselves to embody that. Um, but but yeah, as you say, anyway, I'm with you. I'm with you. Yeah, just be an enlightenment thinker, deal with problems as they arise.
Yeah. Um, Look, I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know it's middle of the day for you, so you've probably got things to do. Whereas my night's going to be
Yes
winding
and
up
no.
soon. Um,
Yes and no.
okay, I'm gonna kind of veer off a little bit here. Like, I want to compare Canada and Australia for a minute. Just before Trump got voted in, things like DEI and the gender issue and men playing in women's sports, all of that was hugely unpopular in Canada. And then Trump got elected, and it was still unpopular, and no one really liked it. And then Trump put out his executive orders on DEI, then he put out his stuff on trans stuff. It was still okay. And then a day or so after that, he put out his, like, officially announced the tariffs on Canada. And
Mm.
then right there, I just saw, like, just, okay, a small sample size. My friends on Facebook, they went, like, my Canadian friends on Facebook went from either not saying anything or being opposed to DEI and, like, the trans stuff, to then just saying screw Trump. No, no, DEI is good. Oh,
Oh,
you know, putting out all this stupid stuff about, oh well, like, if there's six different chromosome matchups, like XXY, XXX, like all these different things, and not understanding what they're putting up, and they're just so that stuff is making a slight resurgence in Canada. So because I know in Australia, I believe it was Queensland, put a pause on puberty blockers. Um,
yeah.
it was very recent. So I'm just curious about that aspect of it in Australia, like, because Trump is so aboard, like, globally. Uh, you know, has that had an effect? Like, were you seeing a rollback on some of this stuff, and now it's just resurging because of Trump, or is it kind of the same as it was before?
Yeah. um, I'm not actually certain. And as you were talking, I'm thinking maybe I don't mix in sufficiently diverse circles um, for me to get a handle on this. I'm just trying to think about my smallish social group. Um, yeah, there was, I think, quite a few people were somewhat upbeat about Trump this time round, even though they weren't in 2016. But yeah, I have heard mutterings that maybe now he's going too far with the tariffs. Yeah, not exactly happy about how he's engaging with Ukraine,
Hmm.
too pro Russia. Um, yeah, I feel like, and when I look around headlines as well, um, just in the last couple of days, all the headlines, a lot of the headlines have started to talk about, recession and economic downturn, and now linking that with Trump. So I suppose I've sensed that broader movement, but then I also wonder whether that's just mainstream media's latest attack on the Trump phenomenon. So when I see all of that, um, I'm unsure. But I imagine with this whole Trump thing, there's, as almost always happens, there's a sort of honeymoon period. And then popularity drops to 35 or 40%, and it just ticks along there, as so often seems to happen. I'm not saying anything particularly concrete. Uh, I guess I have noticed amongst some people who are a bit more upbeat about Trump that they have turned off a little bit. But yeah, I'd have to just say I don't think I'm socially connected enough to
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
like yeah, but no, it's a great question. But yeah, I feel a bit inadequate to answer it because I'm not on social media much and got my head down.
Yeah, like I said, I just noticed it on Facebook and stuff, and it's just,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
sure.
and the majority of the people I'm connected with on Facebook are people actually that I know. You know,
Mm.
did a lot of work overseas, so I got to meet a bunch of different people on, like a decade plus worth of contracts, and it's just the ones who are from Canada. When I see that, and I mean, I joke around the Canadians are like a bunch of cats, and the media and politicians are using Trump like a laser pointer, and they're
Mm.
just so hyper focused on that we're forgetting everything, and just because you hate Trump, and like I told you what I thought of the man. But just because he's opposed to DEI doesn't mean you should start defending it just because Trump hates it. It's
Yeah,
again,
no, it's all inconsistent. It's nuts. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I watched a recent Joe Rogan. Who was he talking to? Anyway, I've forgotten. But they just started out the whole interview just saying, "Yeah, what have you been reading? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to think." I feel that way when I see all these news stories and people swooshing one way and people swooshing the other. It's the perennial problem. Yeah.
okay. Look, like I said, I don't want to keep you too much longer. So, but where to kind of wrap it up with your book? So, where do you see the IDW going forward instead of just fizzling out? Do you see a future for at least like that protocol of it, or do you just think it's going to kind of die out?
Okay, so the basic protocol is open discussion, free speech. I still feel like that's stronger on the right now than it is on the left, and maybe it's going to always be a part of the Western system that one side is a bit more free speechy than the other. Um, but I have some hope for that. Yeah, yeah, the trans stuff, the DEI stuff. I don't know how any of that sort of thing's going to play out. It's whether reason will win through or whether the left doubles down on all of these points. It's hard to tell, especially once the people fighting for it are Trump and the right wing, and then there's this whole thing that we all know about that once you can call someone conservative or right wing, then it doesn't matter what they say, they're just wrong. And so that's unfortunately an enduring part of the problem. I mean, give it another year or so, see if we can come to a bit more sense on the trans issue, which of course is a vast and challenging issue to talk about. Let's see if the free speech stuff can gather momentum. It's just like I say, I quote Shakespeare, from 1600, and it's just the same damn problems. And this whole idea that the human mind's a blank slate and that the human's infinitely malleable. I mean, that's so entrenched in so many people's minds, especially on the left, even if it's an inconsistent idea that doesn't make sense. And I don't really know how you root that out, because once you start talking about those things more concretely, yeah, you end up with, you know, ideas that seem essentialist about men and women, and they aren't. But I don't know. Well, I'm not saying much. What am I trying to say? It's really hard to bring nuance to all of these subjects and all of these topics, and nuance is exactly what's needed. And I guess, as you say, these things have been dumbed down, memeified. They've now gone to the right wing. I hold out some hope that the right wing will make some progress on these ideas, but at the same time, a genuinely meaningful discussion remains close to impossible in most spaces. And as long as that's the case, yeah, I think we just stumble along still, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm the same boat. I hope we can sort some of this stuff out. I hope the free speech stuff works out. Okay, just the latest thing in the States. So this guy, Mahmoud Khalil, so he was arrested because of taking part in protests, and he was leading some of these protests. Now, again, I think this has to be taken on a case by case basis. I believe in his case, he even had some tweets put out that he says, I support Hamas rhetorically, and if I had the means, I would support them financially. he was running protests where he was handing out pro-Hamas flyers. So again, this is a very fine line of, is it free speech or is it endorsing violence? But he was also part of protests where they were saying, we are Hamas. Now, if you're saying you're Hamas, that's getting like, is that rhetoric or what is it? And they called like some of these, and I believe it was like one of the places was at Columbia. They called themselves the Alaska Flood. They called their protest the Alaska Flood, which is what Hamas called the operation on October 7th. There's that line, like this guy is on a green card. They want to deport him. Like, it's going through the courts now, but it's not as free speech as I think you think it is. Like, let's just take Musk and Twitter. Everyone's like, oh, it's a free speech platform. Like, no, Musk even said at the very start, it's like you'll have freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. And as soon as he said that, it's like, okay, you're not free speech.
Ah,
You're not free speech then. Right? You're
mm,
throttling people whose ideas you don't like. That is not free speech. There, and so again, it's one of these things where people don't really think about it. I really like the fact that you quote Mill in your book. A huge fan of Mill. There is one that, I mean, obviously it's too late now, but it was All of Humanity Minus One. So it was like chapter 2 of On Liberty. And actually, Luke Yonoff and Haidt, who you mentioned in your book, they did a animated version of it, or it might have just been Fire, who did an animated, or sort of basically like a graphic novel of that chapter. And it basically says that if all of humanity minus one is of a one opinion, that one person has the right and should be given the right to speak their mind. And in the other sense, that one person cannot then become the tyranny of the minority. So it's a very like the chapter has a lot of meat to it. Um,
mm.
but yeah, so like that's where we're coming at is these people haven't sat down. I mean, I doubt Trump has read Mill, but like they haven't sat down and done that thing that Mill says, where you go and argue with the best interlocutors from the other side that you can find, so you strengthen your own opinion. And I don't think that's actually being done. And again, it's that memification. It's that watering down of thought. It's just you know. Well, I know a lot of people who can quote the for at least the first part of the Milt quote, like he that only knows his side of the argument knows little of that, and they don't know anything beyond it, right? Um, so, so that's where I think that's where we're at, which is a shame because something like free speech needs good, strong, vigorous defense, and it needs people who know what they're talking about, especially if you're in government.
Yeah, I mean, that's just, I mean, everything you were talking about then was vast, everything from supporting Hamas. And so I'm thinking, all right, at some point, free speech stops when you're, advocating violence, potentially supporting a terrorist organization. Who defines what a terrorist organization is? Okay, that's one vast discussion. Um, yeah, properly hearing people from the other side. I mean, social media's yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of people just champion Elon Musk's taking over of Twitter as it's opening up of free speech. Um, to be honest, I don't know enough about what's actually been going on the platform to try to figure out whether it was an improvement or not. I hope it was. But as you say, freedom of speech versus freedom of reach. I mean, I also mentioned in the book, I think Brett Weinstein brings this up, which is so important. And I fear I'm being an armchair anthropologist, but the old Dunbar number,
Yeah,
the idea that way back in the day, humans had small societies, which seems like irrefutable, and therefore you would know everyone in the society. Therefore, you have a sense of people's character, and all of these problems are sort of naturally mediated by just being in a small group. So, what happens when you have a social media platform with billions of people? How do you recreate that basic very, very human dynamic where you just know people and you're just like I know this with like my kid, and his friends, and you see them a few times and you're like, yeah, he's a liar. And Max is like, yeah, he's a liar. And then the other one, you go, oh, he's a good kid. Yeah, he's got values. And then that one over there, he's a bit nervous and runs with the crowd. Like you just know it. But you go into a platform with billions of people. I mean, how do you transform that so that you reproduce that very human quality where you can actually hear stuff and meaningfully judge, I have no idea. It's savage. But maybe, I don't know, we just keep doing what we're doing. If we just keep having conversations, trying to be reasonable, trying to be public, there'll be many, many missteps, but maybe the ship vaguely keeps itself on a middle path. I mean, that's the best I can hope for.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good place to stop. Listen, Jamie, thank you very much for. Well, it's a little bit more optimistic. I don't like leaving on a downer. Sometimes you have no point to it. But Jamie,
Sure.
thank you very much for coming on. Listen,
Thanks a million.
if you have the link to your publisher or anything for your book, let me know, and I'll put it in the show notes. If there's any other link you want me to add, let me know. Send it to me.
Okay.
I'll put it in the show notes, and then people can get access to your book. Which I think most people
Sure.
look, if whether they're interested in the IDW or not, I think people should read it. It does a good history of all these conversations, and
Well, that's the point. I wanted all the conversations and all the arguments that have played such a pivotal role in our time. I just wanted them all in one place,
yeah.
really. But yeah, I mean, look, the books, type intellectual dark web, I don't know, Roberts into the internet and you'll find it. And I guess you can find me, Jamie Q. Roberts. I guess I'm on X. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much again, and thanks everyone for
Thanks,
listening.
Abaid.